Hi, this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And today I have a wonderful author interview with Buddy Levy. He has been on the program before because we talked about one of his books that I just love, Realm of Ice and Sky, Triumph, Tragedy, and History's Greatest Arctic Rescue. I'm so happy to welcome Buddy to Joy on Paper Live. I moved to Texas not too long ago, and I didn't know a lot about Texas, but boy, when you're here in Texas, you hear a lot about Crockett. There are a lot of things named Crockett. There are streets named Crockett. There are buildings named Crockett. It's all over the place here in Texas. So I'm so happy to talk to you about this beautifully written book.
Hey, thanks for having me again, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, Crockett, it's ironic because he spent very little time in Texas, but Texas is known to be big in all ways. And so when something as big as the Alamo happened, they were quick to appropriate Crockett, and he did, in fact, and spent the end of his life there. I'm probably jumping the gun here, but yeah, it's an interesting story.
It's a fascinating story, and you tell it so beautifully. I've heard of Crockett, of course, over the years, but not being great at the history of Texas, I was really impressed with what you wrote in this book. You have really accomplished something absolutely fantastic, because this is how we see him in our minds. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier, and he was born in Tennessee back in 1786, and then he died here in Texas at the Alamo mission, and I'm planning a trip down to San Antonio, so it's going to be very interesting. Whenever a biography really reads like a novel, you know that you've accomplished something. That is the fantastic thing. When an author can take the full history, there's so much material to work with, and then you take it and you just do your little magic thing. And next thing we know, we have a book that reads like a novel. It's so enjoyable. You must have put a lot of time into the research. So tell us, where did you get the idea to do this book?
Yeah, thank you very much. I love that you think it reads like a novel. That's one of the things that, as a writer of history, that I aspire to do, and it's not always easy, but it has to do with often what to leave out as much as what to leave in, and also to remember that there are readers who are turning pages of your book, and you want to keep them doing just that. And so I think it's important to know, one of the things I've learned in my 9 books over time is how to end chapters that are at a natural point that propels you to the next chapter. And that often means stopping at a place that just feels in my gut natural. But back to the question, I actually came across the story of Crockett. It was somewhat of an accident, I have to say. In a lot of ways, it makes sense in retrospect, because I grew up in Idaho, and my father was from Louisiana, is from Louisiana, and I was born in New Orleans, and I grew up, and my father did too, hunting and fishing the bayous and swamps outside of New Orleans. And so he passed that on to me, and I spent a great deal of time as a young person outdoors in the woods, fishing and hunting. And I had ended up, my early writing career was I wrote a lot of short fiction, poetry, and then essays about the natural world. And I was looking to come across the next book project, and it turned out that an agent I was working with and have been with actually now for 23 years, Scott Waxman, he called me one day and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I was actually bird hunting, and I was in my car and I had reception." And I told him that. He said, "That's interesting. He's the best hunter in American history." And I said, "It's probably a toss-up between Daniel Boone and David Crockett." And he said, "Why don't you do some research and write a book about one of them?" And it was a bit of a challenge. He threw down the gauntlet. And so I started researching, and I realized that Crockett, I didn't know much about him, even though I had grown up for a time in Southern California. We were right near Disneyland, and I'm 65 now. And so when I was a child, it was the tail end of the Disneyfication of David Crockett with Fess Parker and all of that stuff. And so I knew about him, but I didn't know much about the real man. And it turned out there hadn't been a full-length book written on Crockett, a biography, in some 50 years. And so I rolled up my buckskin hunting sleeves and went to work researching the life of the frontiersman David Crockett. And it was a few year toil that was really illuminating and fun.
It's a book that is so great because you want to turn the pages, and there are so many things that we didn't know, you didn't know, I didn't know. Just to think of him nowadays, of course, we're always thinking of the House of Representatives, but somehow we never imagine Davy Crockett in the House of Representatives. We think more of him with his knife, but we don't think of him, although maybe nowadays that's appropriate, but the thinking of him walking around in Congress and being in Congress and making speeches, and here he looks so nice and proper, just a great congressman. But that's not the image that we have. So let's go back to the story of what you discovered when you started doing this book, and you said, whoa, this is one really fascinating guy.
Absolutely. One of the things that I was really moved by, a couple of years before the end of his life, he wrote his own autobiography, and it is a classic American text. I think more people should read it. It's really interesting and funny, and he was just a natural born storyteller. He only had 6 months of formal schooling, and that was intermittent because he was truant, and he got in a fist fight with one of his classmates and beat him up on the side of the road. And then his father and the schoolmaster chased him for so far that he outran them, and then he didn't come back for a long time. He went out on the road for a couple of years, actually, because he feared the wrath of his father and the schoolmaster. He's such a fascinating character because, in part, I mean, he's really the quintessential American story in that he did pull himself up from very humble beginnings, and with, like I said, 6 months of formal schooling, but he was quite sharp-witted, and he ended up learning later on the job how to read and write through a position as a magistrate in a small Tennessee town. But I really loved the stories of his earlier life. I was raised on the stories of Mark Twain and Jack London's tales, so I've always really liked rite of passage tales. And Crockett does a great job in his own autobiography of describing his early life. And he was hired out at one point when he was only 12 years old as a bound boy, which was not uncommon at the time, where your father, whoever your patriarch was, if they were in debt, they would hire you out to pay off their debts. And Crockett was a really dutiful son, and he went off for a couple of years with a wagoner on these rough road. They call them road. They were really not much more than wagon trails at the time, moving cattle and goods for different men. And he paid off a number of his father's debts until by the time he was 14 or 16, he had his father relatively solvent. But that ends up being a recurring theme throughout Crockett's life, is that one that I really think is important, that he was constantly striving to better himself, to better his family's situation, but he was also often under the yoke of debt, and it really never left him throughout his life. And so he was always looking to make a living through various schemes, but they were noble schemes. At one point he tried to have a grist mill, a powder factory on the side of the river, and a flood washed away all of his home and works, and then he had to move and rebuild. And another time he attempted to bring all these barrel staves on a flatboat down the Mississippi River, which resulted in, he was notoriously afraid of water, and he ended up flipping the flatboat and nearly drowning and losing all of his materials that he was going to sell at the other end. And he emerged from the portal of this flatboat completely skinned, almost like a rabbit, and he ended up of course, he managed to make good of that situation because when he was brought ashore, some prominent businessmen in Memphis realized who he was and said, come down to the local haberdashers and we'll re-outfit you with clothes and money and send you on your way. So he was always looking at the horizon, at the Western horizon, really, at a time when lots of eyes were cast west to see how we might expand the nation.
It's not easy to be an indentured servant. Kids don't become indentured servants unless they become child stars in Hollywood.
Great point. Yeah.
Those are the only indentured servants we have today. What I found one of the most interesting things was this passage, how he went from no education to educating himself to getting to this point where he lands up in Congress. Not that everybody is in Congress. We sometimes wonder. We're all on Congress these days. It's a combination of determination and then having the help of the right people. And he did make some significant points in Congress when he was against, for example, moving the Native Americans out. So tell us more about that.
Yeah.
Was it one of his wives that helped him get to this point of learning and studying?
Not exactly, because so what ended up happening was that at one point it was funny because he usually it was other people who pushed him to run for office. And in his first role as a magistrate, which is really a kind of small town judge at the time, he was known for being a man of high moral standing and fairness. And he was essentially thrust into this role. And it was during that time, and he must have been in his early to mid 20s at the time, where he realized if he were going to take on this role of magistrate, he would have to learn to read better because his education was so scant. And so he just took it upon himself to study hard. And his parents had been both literate, which on the frontier at the time was something. There were some books around his house, but he was a self-taught person. And so his rise to Congress was, in fact, not completely linear, but it was, again, where circumstances, he started to develop a name for himself by his behavior and antics, and he was incredibly funny. Like, he was just an amazing storyteller in a time when one's ability to tell yarns or tall tales was a kind of currency of its own. And so he would show up, and he was known to be a kind of trickster and prankster and yarn spinner, but also he was legitimate. So he wore hunting garb. He spent most of his life outdoors. The tales of his hunting prowess as far as bears and turkeys and rabbits and everything else was legendary, and he won shooting contests around the region. And so those kinds of things in a not very populated area, they got around, and people knew who you were by your deeds rather than everything that you said about yourself. And ultimately, he is asked to run. And what the stories that I love about him, like you say, we've been in the throes of politics for a decade now. And when you start reading about the way stump speeches worked back in the day, it's really amusing. And you realize that fabrications and tall tales and stretching the truth, this is not new to our political candidates at all. There was a lot of bragging and lying, but one of the things that Crockett would do, which I love about him, he would show up at county fairs and at functions, and he carried with him a flask of whiskey and a bunch of chewing tobacco. And his rationale was that when he offered them his flask of whiskey, they would have to spit out their chewing tobacco to take the shot of whiskey, at which point he would replenish them with his chewing tobacco and leave them as well off as they had been before they encountered him. And he also had all sorts of devious techniques where these guys traveled around on the stump. It was called politicking. A lot of times they would hear each other's speeches over and over again, and Crockett was really smart. He developed a tactic of memorizing the other person's speech, and then he would sometimes jump in there first and he would give the person's speech almost verbatim changing it a little bit to suit his own needs and desires. And then by the time it got to the candidate that was running against him, they would have nothing to say because he just stole all their material. Or, yeah, he just had all sorts of hilarious antics. And I loved how quick-witted he was, how nimble he was in terms of adapting to situations. And the people just loved him.
And perhaps Abe Lincoln learned from him, because that's exactly what Abe Lincoln would do later on, a few decades later. Do the
He
same
most certainly
kind of thing.
would have known about him for sure. I mean, by the time Crockett died in 1836, but he became just a legend.
Quite a legend, because people were so interested in his bear hunting and his shooting, and so this was a really something great for him. I guess politicians are still using shooting things, and some. I mean, nothing changes.
Yeah,
Nothing changes.
Really changes.
You know?
No.
But so what happened when he decided to go to Texas? There was the Indian Removal Act, which I know that he was against.
Yeah. So before there's a few
happen?
things that. Yeah. So there's a few things that predate. What's so amazing is that he lived this incredible. He was 49 years old when he died, and he had lived a really interesting and full life. And he was really, the irony. I was just rereading portions of the section right when he's starting to leave for Texas, and actually got pretty emotional and choked up thinking about what he was trying to do, which was really to improve his life through garnering new and better land for himself and for his family, and just trying to make a go of it, because he was broke. Even though he served 3 terms in Congress, in those days they got $8 a day. He was broke all of his life, and near the end he was trying to make one last stand to improve his fortunes. But one of the things that really I admire about Crockett, and is what you're asking about, it was his political undoing. But at the time, he's a very complex figure. His grandparents were killed by Indians. The settlers in those times, in the late 1700s, were setting up and squatting and setting up lands, building cabins on land that had been previously inhabited by Native Americans. And so there were all ongoing skirmishes for many decades. And Crockett actually served in the Tennessee Mounted Volunteers and the militia under Andrew Jackson, where he was charged with going on these kind of roundup forays. There were numerous tribes down into Florida, south of Tennessee, who were holding out, and the U.S. government was in the process of trying to eradicate and wrangle up as many of these, what they called rogue tribes, as they could. And Crockett, as a frontiersperson himself, he had a lot of admiration for the Native Americans, even though he had been in battles against them in the Creek Wars. But by the time he's in Congress, Andrew Jackson was vehement in wanting to remove all Native American tribes from their tribal homelands across the Mississippi to the west. And Crockett ended up being the only Tennessee delegate to vote against the 1831 Indian Removal Act. And when you think about partisan politics these days and in the past, it's one thing to have your convictions, but it's quite another to vote in a way that is bound to get you ostracized politically. And so Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, was very powerful and influential, and voting against the Indian Removal Act, even though it passed, was yet another mark against Crockett, and it ended up resulting in him losing his last bid for Congress. But so that, and there's another thing that I think really stands out, is that Crockett spent almost his entire time in Congress trying to pass this thing called the Vacant Land Bill, which I have a great deal of respect for too. And the upshot was that people who had pioneers who had moved to Tennessee and built farms and didn't have actual title. And so there were prominent wealthy landowners from North Carolina and South Carolina who were coming in and speculating, and they were kicking off people who had been living there, like Crockett and his family, for a long time. And so Crockett was trying to get this bill passed that would allow people who had improved land and built places there to be offered the chance to purchase it at a reasonable price. But this thing kept getting tabled, and he never actually passed his vacant land bill. And so you could look at his political career as a kind of failure. But what I always found interesting was that he spent most of his time, he was so dogged about the land bill and against the Indian Removal Act that those were his primary passions. And he didn't understand compromise very well. And he also could not vote against his conscience. And so those character traits, I think, ruined him as a politician. Plus the fact that he said himself, he was much better at politicking, at running for office than holding it, because he found the halls of Congress painfully, excruciatingly boring. He was not suited for hours and hours of speeches and meetings, and he was always daydreaming about being off hunting with his dogs. And so he was truant quite a bit in Congress as well, and he would just take off early, and that kind of punctuated his congressional career. But the irony is that the whole time he was there getting nothing done, he kept getting more and more famous.
And he got so famous that everybody wanted to see more of him. There were plays written about him. I think he was a great success in Congress because he stuck to his guns. My goodness, he had integrity, and he didn't do any insider trading. There was no insider trading.
Yeah.
And the idea of the
true.
land,
that's true.
Which I think is also very important, because we have this eminent domain situation where they're turning over plots of land to corporations to take over people's homes.
It's been happening for us since the country was founded. But what I did love that Crockett was understood. He aligned with the people of his district and the people just like him who had worked for many years and built something for themselves. And then he was against the idea that big government could just come in, or people with enough money to make a huge purchase and just take all the land. But I found it really, the other thing that's really intriguing to me is that Crockett, in many ways, prefigured the modern celebrity at such a mirrored level. The opening of the book I chose because it really shows where the legend of a man is the real man, who is actually a congressman at the time, is watching this play where the main character is this guy playing a character named Nimrod Wildfire, but it's really him, and everyone knows it's him. And so there's this elaborate scene where he walks in and the crowd goes wild, and then the actor walks out and everyone cheers, and then Crockett bows in front of him, and the play goes on, and everyone in this full theater in Washington, D.C. knows that this play is about the guy who's just sitting there in the front row. And his life, the mythology of this guy's life and his actual life have come full circle in a really unique way for the time, because celebrity was not something, I don't even know when the term celebrity was coined, actually, but I argue that Crockett is, other than maybe Benjamin Franklin, I think Crockett is the first person who was famous for being famous.
He's an amazing character, and that's what's so fascinating about this book. You mentioned the grandparents. Let's go back and tell a little bit more about where they came from. So this is John Crockett's Tavern, a replica.
Oh, yeah. So the Crockett's, like many other, he came from Scotch-Irish descent, and his mother's side was English. And so they had come over in the mid 1700s. And actually, his grandfather served in the Revolutionary War. And so they had established themselves in the region. And at the time, we're talking about kind of nebulous borders in certain respects between Kentucky and Tennessee. And so they'd been there for some time. And like I said, Crockett grew up in a pretty rustic, I don't know if you have a photo of his early childhood home, but very rustic little cabin. And his father, like I said, his father and his mother were both literate at least, and they worked this tavern. But so Crockett grew up with the tavern house was on a kind of main road, and so there were some rooms for rent, and then they served food and grog downstairs. And so as a boy, he would have been exposed to hard driving mule skinners and roughnecks that are passing on these roads, and exposed to some pretty coarse language. And that actually served him well, because when he ended up going out at 12 on the road himself, he was well used to it, and people grew up much faster than they do today, I think, in certain contexts, because you have to work earlier, and you may or may not have the luxury of school depending on where you are. And so that actually permeates a lot of Crockett's philosophy too, because he was always a little bit either a combination of envious, jealous, and or I guess suspicious of wealthy aristocracy, landowners, highly educated people. He was always a champion for the common person.
Then we get to the Alamo.
Yeah,
This
that's a really interesting moment in his life, because he loses his re-election bid for Congress in 1835, and he had famously, during his campaign speeches, he had said a number of times, if I win, I will do the bidding of my constituents in my Tennessee districts, plural, and if I lose, I'll go to Texas. And he had met previously a man named Sam Houston, who had Texas on his mind, as a lot of Americans did, because Texas was a contentious area at the time. So Crockett ends up losing his election, and true to his word, he goes home. And actually, by this time, I have to say, so Crockett had two wives. His first wife, Polly, with whom he had 3 children, died of unknown causes, but probably some combination of malaria or tuberculosis or something, in 1815. And then he remarried almost immediately a woman nearby who was also a widow, and she had 2 children of her own, but they subsequently had 3 other children. But by the time Crockett loses his final bid, Elizabeth, his second wife, who had been doing pretty much everything on the farm and raising the children while Crockett was off gallivanting, and he wrote, when his book came out, he went on a really long book tour all across the Eastern Seaboard, and he was in the process of becoming this famous person. She was the one at home taking care of everything. So by the time he lost his final bid for Congress, they were pretty much done. She had moved back into her brother's house and was taking care of the kids. But Crockett, to his credit, in his letters that he wrote home from the trail, said, my goal is to go find land and bring you all out here to Texas once I make my fortune. And at the time, the U.S. government was in the process of attempting to wrest Texas from the Mexican rule, and Mexico had only recently become independent from Spain, I think in 1821. So there were claims to the region, both by the United States, and then, of course, the Mexican people were trying to hold on to Texas. And so there were these offers of large landholdings if you would come out and bring your families and then sign an oath of allegiance to the new government. It was like they were in the process of creating the Republic of Texas. And so Crockett, ironically, while going out to look for land and better hunting grounds, he stumbles into the siege of the Alamo. And it was a really propulsive and short period in which this all happens, because it's almost like he was depending on how you look at it, he was either in the right place at the right time, if you want immortality and legend, but he was in the wrong place at the right time, because where he ends up, there was really no hope for survival, because what ends up happening is he signs this oath of allegiance on his way he's just on a hunting trip with his friends, and he stumbles into this political situation in which Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin and these guys are trying to make Texas its own republic, and Crockett understands enough about independence and thoughts of patriotism that he can't not go along with this. So he signs the oath of allegiance and learns that these people who are this garrison at San Antonio is being they're defending it against what they believe is thousands of Mexican troops that are coming. And so Crockett arrives there just weeks before, while this General Santa Anna is on a march with many thousands of Mexican troops. And the U.S. military is completely fractured and dispersed across wide swaths of Texas at this point, which is a huge state. And at the time, it wasn't even a state, it was just contested territory that was, and so getting news to each other, having military movement and support and resupport was really time consuming and difficult. And so Crockett stumbles into the garrison at the Alamo and realizes that he's bit off more than he could chew, but he's certainly not going to abandon those that are defending it, and ends up being history because on March 6th, 1836, Santa Anna, they hold out for a while, and the military men that are stationed there are writing letters of appeal and sending men on horseback with these letters saying, we're going to hold out as long as we can, but we're surrounded and we need reinforcements yesterday. And by the time they're completely surrounded, there's only 150 some defenders of this garrison that's been reinforced and shored up to a degree, but they're surrounded by a few thousand Mexican troops, and they really have no prayer, and it's a slaughter.
It's so small.
Yeah, that's what I thought when I visited. I go to all the places that I write about and try to imagine, I try to cast back in time and imagine it as it was during the time that I'm writing about. And of course, in a place like San Antonio, it's pretty hard because you've got this big flourishing city now. But if you're able to close your eyes and get out into the country and imagine what it was like, yeah, it was really stark to think that they were trying to hold on to this place against such overwhelming odds. And what was really remarkable is how it doesn't take very long. Once they're attacked on the like sunrise on March 6th, and it's over within a couple of hours, really. And Santa Anna had said no quarter given. So he had flown a red flag in the weeks and days prior to the attack, which meant if you surrender now, we may have recourse for you, but if you don't surrender and we have to attack and come in and take you over, then there are no prisoners being taken. We're going to kill you all. And so it's a little spotty, actually. The record is a little spotty as to exactly where Crockett was on the morning of the fighting, and just true to his life, depictions of him in subsequent artworks and stuff have him, some famous ones, have him swinging his musket butt at Mexicans at the very end, going down, being the last man standing. And none of that can be historically confirmed, though where he had been stationed within the compound was known, and he likely was because of the south wall, he likely was one of the last people that was put to death. Then Crockett's world and legend and mythology just absolutely flourishes from there.
So this is said to be Davy Crockett's knife. Did you see it? It was in the museum?
I did. And I think there's a firearm too. One of his rifles is there. And those things are really amazing pieces of antiquity, especially his rifle because he was known. He was given one as a gift that had he had this motto that was, "Be always sure you're right, then go ahead." Meaning, think about what you're going to do, develop a concerted notion about it, and once you've decided that you're right, go ahead, meaning go forward. And he did that throughout his entire life. I think even going to the Alamo, whether there were, he may have had multiple reasons, knowing that if he did end up being a celebrated war hero, if somehow he got out of that scrape, many of the most prominent men in Washington at the time were celebrated war heroes. So he certainly understood that the cachet that would bring. But I was really, again, what ended up, how his life took on this other dimension even afterwards. And you have to remember that, as I mentioned, he had written a book that went through 7 printings, his own autobiography. There were books written about him, which were really successful. There was that play that ran for a number of years about him, The Lion of the West. And then after he died, there were more plays that one guy, I forget his name, it's Frank Mayo, I think. He played the character of Crockett for something like 24 years. And then, of course, everything changed with Walt Disney, who made a 3-part series in the early 50s about Crockett. And something about, I don't know if you ever watched the thing with Fess Parker.
I think I've seen clips. I didn't.
Yeah, it was like must-see viewing. And it was early Disney. And what ended up happening was that they had no idea how successful it was going to be, or they certainly wouldn't have killed him off by the 3rd installment, because it was partly based on history and part fabrication. And they had him wearing that coonskin hat with the tail and everything, which there are pictures, the early depictions of him, and the most famous one, which he stood for and he sanctioned. He is wearing a skin hat, but it's not a raccoon with that tail. But that became what Fess Parker always wore. And what ended up happening was this merchandising frenzy that was the first of its kind. And so for a 5-year period or so, you could buy literally anything: mail, lunch boxes, toys, figurines, toy guns, toy powder horns, everything with Crockett on it. And it became what in today's monetary terms would be like a multi-billion-dollar industry, just based around the depictions of this famous frontiersman, David Crockett.
I didn't realize that it was a 3-part. I thought it was like years. I thought it ran for years because kids were wearing, even I remember as a kid, some of the boys were wearing the coonskin hat for Halloween.
Oh, yeah. And so I think what ended up happening, it was like young Davy Crockett goes to Washington, and Crockett goes to the Alamo. And then it might have been picked up and re-franchised, but it was an absolute runaway, massive cultural event, and everyone just thought it was so cool. And then Fess Parker becomes the guy that we associate with Crockett. Now, I will say, though, I was really pleased that John Wayne played Crockett in the Alamo later in a film version that he spent something like $7 million in the 60s, which at the time was a lot of money to put into a production, not by today's standards, but by then. And then, of course, Billy Bob Thornton played Crockett in a more recent Alamo film, which was really cool and I really loved Billy Bob's interpretation of him. And I basically love everything that Billy Bob Thornton does, but as Crockett, he was really cool. And the writing was good because he understood. There were a few salient moments where at the Alamo, Crockett, I mean, obviously some liberties are taken here, but they're really great. At one point, the Mexican army is playing their music off just a few hundred yards away in these bands. And then Crockett gets up on the ledge of the Alamo alone and plays the fiddle, and all of the Mexican band players stop and they're listening to him, and one soldier just nudges the other and he says, "Crockett." And so they know that This guy, he's known even to the enemy. And but Billy Bob is looking out through these slats when they know that the Mexicans are attacking, or they're about to attack. Billy Bob is looking out through the slats, and he says to Sam, I think to Jim Bowie, he goes, "If it was just me, little old Davy from the cane brakes of Tennessee, I might just hop over this wall and get out of here. But this other fella, Davy Crockett, the one that they've made me into, that's the one they're all looking at."
That's it.
He can't escape his own mythology.
If he had survived the Alamo, he would have become president of the United States.
I think so. I believe you.
Really, everything would have changed because he would have been elected president of the United States. He would have really taken a different approach to the Indian situation. Things would have been a lot different, I think, if he had been elected president.
Yeah, now listen, though, I'm not sure that I will temper that by saying for better or worse, because I'm not sure how well we've done with celebrities as our presidents. We're in the throes of it now, but we have a history of, yeah, it's interesting because at the time, Crockett would have been, yeah, his fame would have just been cemented even more in his lifetime than it ended up being. And it's so fun to speculate on what he might have accomplished.
Exactly. I'm glad you used the word fun because I think the book is fun. We know that the ending, we know it's not going to be ending, but in between, you tell such a great story. As I said, you make it, it's a novel, a real page turner, and people will find, I get such a kick out of it. And I think anybody who's interested in modern day politics and what's happening in the House of Representatives today will get a kick out of reading this book. Really, it's just a fun book to read. So, Buddy, I'm glad that you came out with this book, and I'm so happy that you're going to be promoting it all over the place, I'm sure. Do you have a lot of bookstores around Texas?
They're in the works.
They're in the works.
They're in the works. Yeah.
Okay.
But so I really appreciate you having me and for your enthusiasm about this book and about literature in general. It's great to see.
Thank you. And I'm having fun. I just celebrated the 10th anniversary of my syndicated radio program and the first anniversary of the YouTube channel.
Congrats.
And I'm having lots of fun
excellent.
doing this. Yeah. If you are in the Austin area, let me know, and maybe I'll come to your book signing, huh? How about that?
Hey, I would love that. And yeah, thanks for the support of authors and readers. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Again, Buddy Levy, this is your website. People can go there, find out more. Buddy has, all of his books are great. I love the stories, of the exploration stories.
Yeah, me
because
too.
You are an adventurer.
Yes, I try to be as much as possible. I like to go where I'm writing about, and that has led me to some pretty wild places over the years.
It certainly has. And we'll have you back. You've got more books that I want to talk about. I want to talk about all of them. So I'll have you back again, okay?
I look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you for joining me today on Joy on Paper Live. I appreciate it. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to Joy on Paper so that I can bring you more interviews with fascinating authors. All you have to do is click that button, subscribe, comment, and share. Please get Crockett, The Real-Life Adventures of a Frontier Legend. You'll love the book. It's fascinating, and Buddy Levy is a great author. Thank you for joining me. Please click that button, subscribe, comment, and share. Bye-bye now.